through the speakers at his own engagement party, freezing the 100 guests in the ballroom. Before I could even process the collective gasp of the crowd, his hands gripped my shoulders and violently dragged me out of my wheelchair. I collapsed onto the cold, polished floor like a broken doll, my useless legs twisting beneath me. Instead of helping, my dad stepped forward, glaring down at me, and spat out that I was the family's biggest failure, while my mother completely looked away in disgust. They thought they had finally exposed my lie and broken my spirit in front of high society. What they didn't realize was that an anonymous guest had already dialed 911. Exactly 15 minutes later, the heavy doors burst open and 5 police officers entered the ballroom. And that's when my family's darkest, most buried secret was finally brought to light. My name is Maya, and at 27 years old, my entire world has been measured by the width of 2 rubber wheels and the crushing weight of my family's perfectionism. To the outside world, the sterling name means old money, prestige, and flawless reputations. But inside our estate, it meant living under a regime where weakness was treated as a crime. Ever since the terrible day I ended up in this wheelchair, my life hasn't just been a battle against my own paralyzed body. It's been a daily war against the people who gave me life. "You're just not trying hard enough, Maya," my mother would sigh, looking down her nose at me as if my condition were a stain on her freshly polished floors. My older brother, Tristan, was even worse. He took every opportunity to whisper venomous doubts to anyone who would listen, convincing our social circles that my paralysis was entirely psychological, a pathetic, desperate bid for attention from a daughter who couldn't measure up to his achievements. They relentlessly gaslit me, turning my physical prison into a mental torment, making me feel like a parasite in my own home. My dad completely agreed, treating my disability as a personal insult to his legacy. For years, I believed their twisted narrative, trapped in a house where my suffering was mocked and my reality was denied. I was completely isolated, forced to depend on their financial support while they used my vulnerability to keep me compliant, invisible, and deeply ashamed of a broken body I couldn't change. The air inside the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and old money. It was the night of Tristan's engagement party, a lavish celebration engineered to cement his standing in high society. As always, I was positioned in a dimly lit corner, a tragic prop meant to showcase my family's enduring patience with their difficult daughter. Clara, Tristan's fiancée, glided past me in a designer dress, throwing me a look of pure pity that made my skin crawl. Tristan stood at the center of the room, downing scotch and absorbing the praise of 100 wealthy guests, his eyes occasionally darting toward my wheelchair with an intense, brewing hostility. As the evening peaked, Tristan clinked his glass and took the microphone. The room fell silent. But instead of proposing a toast to his future bride, his sharp, intoxicated gaze locked directly onto me. "Before we celebrate the future, we need to address the elephant in the room," he boomed, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. The crowd shifted uncomfortably as he marched toward my corner. In a flash of pure aggression, he reached down to make a scene. "She's faking it for sympathy," he yelled, grabbing my shoulders with terrifying force. Before I could scream, he violently dragged me straight out of my wheelchair, tossing me onto the cold, polished floor. My useless legs twisted beneath me as a collective gasp ripped through the ballroom. I was exposed, broken, and utterly humiliated. I lay there on the hard, unforgiving floor, the sharp pain in my hips barely registering against the stinging numbness of total humiliation. The whispers of 100 onlookers swirled above me like a cloud of locusts. I looked up, desperate for a shred of humanity, but my dad simply stepped forward, his face twisted into a mask of pure rage. "You are the family's biggest failure," he snarled, his voice a lethal whisper that carried perfectly across the silent room. Beside him, my mother deliberately shifted her gaze, looking away in total disgust, as if I were a piece of garbage he had just swept aside. Tristan stood over me, panting, a smug, victorious grin spreading across his face as he waited for me to miraculously stand up and prove his twisted theory right. But I couldn't move. The silence in the ballroom became deafening, heavy with the realization of what they had just done. Then, without warning, the grand, frosted glass double doors of the ballroom were violently breached. The heavy thud of combat boots shattered the stunned quiet as 5 uniformed police officers marched directly into the room. The guests scrambled backward, parting like the Red Sea as the officers moved with absolute, unyielding purpose. Tristan's smug grin instantly vanished, and my father stepped forward, trying to reassert his wealthy authority, demanding to know the meaning of this intrusion. But the lead officer didn't even look at him. He walked straight toward my crumpled form on the floor. The lead officer knelt beside me, his expression softening as he signaled for paramedics, but my eyes darted past him to the back of the room. Stepping through the grand doors was a face I hadn't seen in over 2 years. Dr. Vance, my former physical therapist, who had suddenly vanished from my care without a word. My parents visibly stiffened, the color draining from my father's face as Dr. Vance walked forward, holding a thick, red medical folder in his hands. He looked down at me with a mixture of profound guilt and fierce determination. Turning to the officers and the crowd of stunned high society guests, he opened the folder and began to speak, his voice cutting through the tense air like a scalpel. "She isn't faking anything," Dr. Vance announced clearly. "But her family has been faking the truth for over a decade." He revealed that he had spent the last 2 months working with an independent legal team to unseal the original, unaltered hospital records from the night of my childhood accident. The truth was monstrous. I didn't just have a tragic, unavoidable accident. When we were teenagers, a reckless, intoxicated Tristan had crashed the family ATV with me on the back, crushing my spine. To protect Tristan's future and the family's immaculate name from a massive criminal investigation, my parents used their immense wealth to bribe the original attending doctors. They completely covered up Tristan's fault, sealed my true neurological reports, and forced medical staff to alter my files to make my paralysis seem entirely psychosomatic. They willfully trapped me in a psychological prison, making me believe my inability to walk was my own mental failure, all to shield a guilty son. The lead detective stepped forward, his boots clicking sharply on the polished floor as he snatched the red folder from Dr. Vance. He opened it deliberately, pulling out official, ironclad warrants alongside the newly unsealed medical records, holding them up for the entire ballroom to see. I watched from my humiliating position on the cold floor as my parents' pristine, million-dollar facades completely crumbled into ash. The detective's voice boomed through the speakers, ensuring every single guest heard the sickening truth. "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling," he declared coldly, "you are under investigation for multi-million-dollar medical fraud, grand larceny, and the systematic abuse of a dependent adult." The crowd erupted into a flurry of shocked whispers as the detective laid out the financial trap. The original police reports proved that my grandfather had left me a massive, independent trust fund specifically meant to cover my lifelong medical care and ensure my complete financial independence. But my parents couldn't let me have that control. For over 10 years, they had used the fraudulent medical files, the ones claiming my paralysis was entirely in my head, to legally maintain control over my estate. They had systematically embezzled millions from my trust fund to pay off the dirty doctors who helped them hide Tristan's crimes, while simultaneously funding Tristan's failed business ventures and lavish lifestyle. They deliberately kept me isolated, gaslit, and utterly dependent on their fake charity, telling me I was a financial burden while they actively stripped my bank accounts bare. They had stolen my mobility, my youth, and my inheritance, all while pretending to be my saints. The lead detective gave a sharp nod, and the other 4 officers stepped forward, pulling heavy steel handcuffs from their belts. Tristan's face turned a horrific shade of white as an officer grabbed his arms, forcing them behind his back. The metal clicked shut with a loud, definitive snap that echoed through the silent ballroom. My father began to scream, threatening lawsuits and throwing around the names of powerful politicians, but his wealth meant nothing now. An officer pinned his hands behind him, clicking another pair of cuffs into place. They were being arrested live, exposed as criminals in front of the very high society elite they had spent their entire lives trying to impress. My mother collapsed onto a nearby chair, burying her face in her hands as the guests turned their cameras toward her, recording the spectacular ruin of the Sterling family name. The pristine reputation she valued far more than her own daughter's life was utterly destroyed in a matter of seconds. Two paramedics gently stepped in, carefully lifting me off the cold floor and placing me securely back into my wheelchair. As I was raised up, the crushing weight of shame that had suffocated me for over a decade completely vanished. I looked at my brother and father being marched out of the room in chains, and for the first time in 27 years, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt an overwhelming sense of ultimate vindication. The house of cards built on my suffering had finally fallen. 3 months later, I am finally free. Using my legally reclaimed trust fund, I moved away from that toxic city and bought a beautiful, fully accessible home overlooking the coast. My father and Tristan are currently awaiting trial behind bars, while my mother lives in complete social isolation, ruined by the truth. I am finally getting the real medical care and physical therapy I always deserved, building a life defined by my own strength rather than their cruel lies. Now, I'm deeply curious about all of you who have stayed to listen to my story. What would you have done if you discovered your own family had stolen your life and your freedom just to protect a lie? Have you ever had to cut off toxic people to save yourself? Or watching from so, I can see how far Maya's story of vindication has reached. Before you go, I'm leaving 2 other incredible, shocking stories right here on the final screen that I know will absolutely surprise you.